Hey everybody, welcome to Ecology Chapter 2, Principles of Ecology. I'm filming this from my backyard here in New Jersey. So maybe take out your homework from a few days ago where you looked at vocabulary terms, maybe have open BioZone. Also on your iPad there's going to be a few times when I ask you to stop and maybe read a section, parts where I'm going to ask you to stop and find a link to click on and watch a video, and other parts where there's an assignment kind of attached to go along with the lecture. All right, when we think of ecology, we're thinking of the root word oikos from the Greek, which means home, or the study of interaction between organisms, living and non-living components of their environment. Later on, that's going to be our biotic and abiotic components. You can hear some of those in the background, right? I did outside today because the birdies are singing, and you can see a whole lot of the abiotic conditions of the ecology of this backyard and what we call our home. In section 2.1 you can peek over here and see a whole bunch of different vocabulary. You'll note that some of these were used earlier on in the year for evolution and genetics and even biochemistry. As we get into ecology, we're reminded of the founder or the namesake of our city. Chief Seattle said, "Man did not weave the web of life, we're merely a strand in it. Whatever we do to the web, we do to ourselves. All things are bound together, all things connect." And then our main guy, E.O. Wilson, who said, "Humanity did not descend as angelic beings into this world, nor are we aliens who colonized Earth. We evolved here one among many species across millions of years, and exist as one organic miracle linked to others. The natural environment we treat with such unnecessary ignorance and recklessness was our cradle and our nursery, our school, and remains our one and only home. To its special conditions we are intimately adapted in every one of our bodily fibers and biochemical transactions that gives us life." And a fun John Muir quote that I love, followed even with Albert Einstein in an ecological view of life and the world. St. Bonaventure, who said, "The origin, magnitude, and multitude, beauty, fullness, activity, and order of all created things are the very footprints and fingerprints of God." A lovely quote from one of my idols, Edward Abbey. And then the most important diagram from this section that weaves together physics to chemistry and biology. You'll note that in blue we've got chemicals that cycle or recycle. Those would be the things of the periodic table, the elements and atoms of the universe and of Earth. And then the flow of energy. So chemical cycling, chemistry; energy flow, the physics. Energy flowing start with the sun. You can see those guys move all around. Some of this might remind you of last year in physics. The connection between those and the interaction of energy and matter and the flow and cycle gives us biology, and at its broadest or widest level, the study of ecology. In our book they talk about the different jobs and different roles that ecologists can have, all the way down from global ecology through organism ecology. Go ahead and pause the video now and look up one example, if you can, from scientific research and literature on one of those types of ecological research or one of those jobs. Moving on to the biosphere, the biggest element or biggest area of hierarchy for biology. Here's a cool map from Buckminster Fuller that shows, as close as we can, the relative proportions of the continents or land masses. All right, back to our levels of biological organization, from the really small to the really big. We are focusing in on ecosystems and the biosphere, but recall all the way down to cells, organelles, and atoms, as we saw in biochemistry earlier in the year. Recall what we listened to last week, putting a price tag on nature, and the radio lab that we listened to, how do you put a price tag on nature? There's different biotic factors. Here's an interesting table. We want to try and connect this to our work with Green Lake. So the abiotic or the non-living factors versus the biotic factors. Each of these we'll talk about in turn throughout this lecture. Here's the way in which the biotic living factors and abiotic non-living contribute to the ecosystem. You might even want to put together your own Venn diagram that shows how these overlap. Coming up soon when I get back, we'll look at the effects of abiotic factors on our Green Lake microcommunity. So think back to a few weeks ago when we took a peek at what's inside of Green Lake, particularly the plankton, both the zoo and phytoplankton. We'll want to arrange it in a hypothesis form. If we do this testable action, then we expect this predicted outcome. Make sure it's specific and testable. These are some of the different things that we're testing at Green Lake. Remember that once we get back, we will be making 3 passes, 3 swipes, in order to try and categorize different algae, plankton, and daphnia. Here's a nice little map. Get a nice birdie singing in the background. So the levels of organization that we saw earlier, from small to big, work in these ways. You could peek in your book and it shows kind of an interactive little piece for you, or a lab review. Here's one that shows it vertically from top to bottom, hanging out with some antelope. Here it is, you can see on a systems level, from nervous system to organs to the nervous system, all the way up to the biosphere. For some reason, this little picture of the nervous system reminds me of a creepy floating ghost. As we move further and further, we get into the term niche, which is a role or position that an organism plays in its environment. Think back to our biointeractive HHMI video on keystone species and the different niches that they encountered, from the starfish to kelp to sea anemones. Also, we looked at lizards and the anal lizards. Take a time out. Go ahead and look up on YouTube Battle at Kruger National Park. I'll provide you with a link, or you could just type it in. Here we get into different types of symbiotic relationships. The root of the word means living together, or same, symbiosis, so same life. And it doesn't just mean positive, or good for both. There's lots of different interactions. Here's a quick table that shows you. One that we looked at early in the year shows this. Generally, mutualism, good for species 1 and 2, or species A and B. Commensalism, where you have good for one and the other is unaffected or nearly unaffected. And parasitism, good for one, bad for the other. Here you can see it with pollination, case of a clownfish. You got commensalism in the case of sea turtles, parasitism in the case of parasitic worms, or herbivory in caterpillars, or a mosquito. This figure shows it a little bit easier and fleshed out a little more with predation, herbivory, and parasitism. Remember herbivory when we talked with Dr. Chris Frost in our Skype? We'll look at some examples of these coming up. I also want to point out coexistence, where species don't have a net positive or negative impact on each other, and competition, where it can be negative for both species involved. Take a quick time out here before moving on and do a quick research. We want to try and find 2 examples of mutualism, commensalism, and parasitism. Do that on your own, and then share that with your table mates and try and compile as many different examples as you can. I'm going to flip through rather quickly a few that I'd come up with. This would be a good place to look here on nature.com. We've all seen mutualism in the case of the anemone and in Finding Nemo. An even better example that I love is where coral, when they're attacked by algae and kelp that are growing on them, they don't want that. They can then release a chemical, so a form of allelopathy, that signals for fish to come around and eat or chomp away and take away that competing algae or kelp and clean up the coral. And it's interesting because it only happens when the coral is getting eaten or attacked by a few different specific species of coral and algae. You can see it with ants and acacia trees. We also want you to take a time out and look at, this is starting in minute 41. on the PBS Nova video, Evolutionary Arms Race, looking at leaf cutter ants and the symbiotic mutualistic relationship with the ants, with the fungi, and with the bacteria that make antibiotics that keep that fungi in check. So it's kind of a three-way symbiotic relationship. It's very elegant and beautiful. Here's a quick overview of what you're going to see in that video. Coming up when I get back, we're going to do a termite symbiosis lab. Here it's where termites are hanging out with a number of different microbes that allow them to break down and digest wood. Here's a few of those guys. You'll note that, oh hey, they look kind of similar to some of the plankton that we see in Green Lake. So different guys, but they're in the same kingdom. These are protists also. You can see it with jellyfish in Jellyfish Lake in Palau. Commensalism examples might be where you'd have some grazing Cape buffalo or water buffalo, and as they move through the underbrush, they're stirring up the grass and thus the insects that are living in them, and the birdies come along and they chomp them up one by one. The Cape buffalo don't really benefit from the birds, but the birds benefit from the Cape buffaloes that are moving through and churning up the insects for them. Parasites here with maybe a worm that you might have, heartworm in the case of your dog, likely that your dog takes some medicine for that. We've talked about it in the case of malaria and mosquitoes. Mentioned earlier with our Skype conversation with Carl Zimmer, and one of his cover articles for National Geographic, Real Zombies. Here's some crazy looking pictures. You could type this into Google if you wanted to take a closer look. So beetles and crickets and nematode worms, just like our Skype with Dr. Steve Noviak here with crabs. You could pause this and maybe zoom in to read it a little bit more clearly. So all sorts of crazy little dudes and monstrous looking examples. Here's one with Toxoplasma gondii that is very interesting. Here's what we talked about with those red-rumped ants, caterpillars and stinging wasps. There's cordyceps, our favorite fungi. It's in spiders, it's everywhere. We watched this video earlier. You are free to take a peek back at it if you'd like. Here's a really funny link if you look up from the Colbert Report a few years ago. And a tongue-eating parasite, yucky. And it also reminds us of our Radiolab parasites from a while back. Also, let's consider this in the context of epidemiology and kind of a worldwide experience of disease. This is from a year or so ago when we had the Ebola outbreak. Interesting to consider the different environmental and ecological impacts that make diseases, in some cases, far worse. From that article, they gave us 5 determinants of health: our genetics, personal behavior, medical care, physical environment, and socioeconomic factors. Moving through, that's the end of section 2.1. We can take a look at some of these different questions in there. When I do get back, we will have a quiz on this, and don't worry, we'll have plenty of time to go over it in more detail. Section 2.2, flow of energy in an ecosystem. So we had the basics, section 2.1, we're going to get to flow of energy, and then the cycling of matter will be next. Take a peek over here at some of the key new vocabulary that you should already have in your notebook, so have those open as we kind of check these off our list. We're returning to the same figure. So back to flow of energy. Energy flows through a system. About a year ago, you would have been studying in physics conservation of energy in chapter 9, and this reminds us. So starting from the sun, we have these red arrows, and you'll also recall from your activity last week in Please Pass the Energy. So some of the different rules and laws that govern flow of energy in a physical system and in a biological system. Right? I like to have it in here. Energy flows, matter cycles. You can see it here from the sun and to the earth. This is our movement from chaos to cosmos, from disorder to order, right? It's life that does this. You can recall different food webs or food pyramids. 300 trout are needed to support a man for a year. The trout in turn must consume 900 or 90,000 frogs that must consume 20 million grasshoppers to live on 100 tons of grass. So as each trophic level goes up, the amount of available energy goes down. You can see this shown in kilocalories from the 1 million provided by sunlight all the way up to the top with the rattlesnake as a tertiary consumer eating that mouse and getting just 10 kilocalories. Here's another way to look at it. Again, at each step, you're getting, if we look back, 10% of that energy passed on, hence the 10% rule. Here it is, if a slightly different set of trophic levels. At the peak here, there's an eagle, so maybe take a look out the window and see if you can see some of the bald eagles or the ospreys hanging around Green Lake. This is a cute kind of kid's drawing. Again, you can have all sorts of different levels, more or less depending on the ecosystem. This shows 5, it shows kind of the available pieces. This being in an ocean setting from phytoplankton up to a top peak predator such as a tuna. Take a quick peek if you have a timeout from National Geographic Food by the Numbers, when food is fuel. It's an interesting look. Takes a look at how much feed goes into making the animal. So 10 kilograms of feed could make 9 kilograms of grasshopper, but only 1 kilogram of cow. So that's a 10% rule here with the cow, but it's almost 100% for the grasshopper. Perhaps the future of food is in insects. Take a pause on this and look at the different nutritional breakdown of different kinds of food sources. You'll see again insects, pretty good, pretty tasty. Here you see the same thing, so different animals having different ability to convert their energy source into actual flesh, which is then consumed by us. Another interesting diagram. This should relate back and remind us of what we learned in Please Pass the Energy, or Pass the Energy Please. Again, noting the bold terms here with auto versus heterotroph. Can you self-make, or are you providing energy result via sunlight, or do you have to gain it elsewhere, in the case of the lynx having to eat the hare? You got different strategies for the different kingdoms. Protists having all three, right? That they can be autotrophic, heterotrophic, and detrivores. Fungi, for the most part, are detrivores, as seen here. Right, this could be a good pausing point, time out, to construct a food web of your own before we look at some others. And these activities are much as we've seen before. This is one of my favorite Onion articles. Man at the very top of food chain chooses bugles. Maybe pause it and look at that in a little more detail. Here's a marine ecosystem, not too dissimilar to ones we'd find in the Puget Sound. This has a curse word in it, so maybe don't watch this just yet, but kind of interesting at minute 1:16. A beautiful aquatic, not unlike Green Lake, food web and food chain. Take a look at this and see the person sitting next to you, which one of these organisms do they look most like. All right, chapter 2, section 3. So the cycling of matter. Again, last we saw was the flow of energy. Now we're cycling matter. The key take home on this is hopefully you've got some pictures from last week when you did the Biogeochemical Cycles. So the life, earth, and chemistry. And the chemistry part of it is this. Yeah, it's the cycling of matter. We got our main idea, which is essential nutrients cycled through biogeochemical processes, and we've got some new vocab hanging out over on the side. We're reminded of this diagram for section 2-3. We're in the blue part, and these things that cycle back and forth, round and round. We're reminded of the bioenergetics of it. with photosynthesis and cell respiration, whether it's with some spinach or maybe the sandwich you had for lunch or the banana you had for breakfast. Interestingly, decomposers such as bacteria, fungi, and some protists are every bit as essential in the cycling of matter and in this ecological process as are the producers and the consumers. In this section we're going through, you can click on these diagrams and look more in depth at some of these cycles. We've got some static pictures. Again, good idea to have out your biogeochemical cycles. Note that what we gave you on the colored sheets of paper are just some options. They're not every single possibility that could go into all of these different cycles. Starting with water cycle, moving to carbon. Those are different elements that are involved. Again, we have our different colors for nitrogen, phosphorus, and carbon dioxide. Really, you could do a cycle for just about any element or any chemical constituent within the environment. Consider from biochemistry our periodic table, kind of the basis of our chemistry. Think back here, our elements, the elements of life and what we find in the human body being nearly identical to the elements that you'd find in the earth. So our elements of life: oxygen, carbon, hydrogen, and nitrogen. If you wanted, you could look up the Elements app or the Elements song on YouTube or on the internet if you like. The fifth most common element being phosphorus, followed by potassium. You can even think about this every time that you eat, as you consider the cycling of starting with the earth to then what's eaten and then you, the eater, and the fact that it's interconnected and interdependent. We'll note that, that doesn't work so well because it's not synced up. Oh well. But what I wanted to say is that biological processes in the cycling of matter is not linear. That's why I crossed it off. It's not just a cause and effect. It's not simply a reactants and products, but things that cycle around. Right? Nature does not have waste. You recall too some similar things with the YouTube video that I made a while back on biomimicry, life's principles. Maybe take a quick look at that. It's only about 2 minutes long. Reminded that life is interconnected and independent, so that inputs become wastes and wastes become input. Right? Growth and decay are together as one. Right? And even life and death on the grand scale of things biologically. Come back to our water and carbon cycles. Take a closer look, zooming in at nitrogen and phosphorus. Maybe you could go back to your diagrams from the other day and add something, or maybe you want to rearrange or swap something out, or add in a connecting piece that might make it more succinct or a clearer version. There's our water cycle. Reminded that water is cycling even within its 3 different states, so from solid, liquid to gas. Even in the Bible, right, the basis of our food chain being grass or solar energy, so that all flesh is grass. We see it in the case of a cow and the grass that it eats, the sunlight coming in, contributing up top to photosynthesis, so carbon dioxide in the air, water in the ground, plus sunlight energy, byproducts of some kind of carbohydrate, in this case glucose, and oxygen. That then feeds into cell respiration within that cow. We see this on the Great Plains with buffalo and caribou and elk and Cape buffalo. You can see it with aquaponics in the case of nitrogen and pest control. We'll look at this in more detail coming up when I get back. So maybe just hang on to that. Here's a really nice look at fish poop or rabbit poop and the way that bacteria contribute to denitrification and nitrogen fixation. So the movement of ammonia, which would be what you'd smell in pee oftentimes, especially if you were to stop at a dirty restroom or bathroom, and the conversion of ammonia, NH3, to nitrite NO2 to trait NO3 that's then used by plants. So your biogeochemical cycle for nitrogen should hopefully look somewhat like this. Here it can be seen within an aquaponics setup and the way that bacteria, plants, and fish can work together to grow both plants and grow fish. You can pause this and take a look and read down the side as it explains it, or even take a look on YouTube or Google, maybe a TED Talk about how aquaponics works. Here it is on a system or tray level. This should also remind us from last week with the poop train and the cycling of matter as it exists on the processing of our wastes. You can see this, what's going on in National Geographic and the carbon cycle, the way in which trees and plants cycle our carbon. And that's it, y'all. Here's a quick look at some of our pictures from the book. You can have a look at the assessments in the back if you like. Make sure we're taking a peek at our different diagrams. And of course, let me know if you have any questions. Thanks, guys.